They said I'd be alone, that the echoes of my footsteps would be the only voice I'd ever hear again. I remember the night they told me that as if it had been branded on the inside of my eyelids. The rain was falling in sheets, slamming against the windows, like it was trying to drown out the sound of their laughter. I stood there in the living room, clutching a tattered suitcase that held everything I had left. My father's old coat still smelled like home, but tonight it felt like nothing more than a burden on my shoulders. I watched their faces cold, hard, unflinching. My brother's wife was the one who spoke first. Her lips twisted into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so cruel. "You're an extra mouth to feed," she said. "This isn't a charity." My brother looked away, his shoulders hunched, like he was trying to fold himself into the floor. I wanted to believe he didn't agree, but the silence was an answer in itself. I swallowed hard, feeling the bitterness burn down my throat. I thought about arguing about fighting for my place here, but I didn't have the strength. My fingers curled tighter around the handle of my suitcase. My pulse thudded in my ears, a steady, stubborn beat that told me, "You're not as small as they think you are." So I left. The door slammed shut behind me, the final punctuation mark on a story I hadn't written. I stepped out into the rain, the cold biting into my skin. Each step away from that house felt like tearing a page out of a book my story no longer belonged to them. The streets were slick and dark, the city's glow turned to a dull haze behind the downpour. I kept my head down, shoulders hunched, the suitcase thumping against my leg with every step. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and I realized I didn't even know where I was going. My breath misted in the cold, each exhale a silent prayer. Don't let me break. I found a cheap motel near the edge of town, the neon sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. The man at the front desk didn't look up. When I walked in, just slid a key across the counter and took my last $20 without a word. The room smelled of mildew and stale cigarettes, but it was warm and the door locked behind me. That was enough. I dropped the suitcase on the sagging bed and sat down beside it. My hands shook as I traced the frayed edges of the fabric, each thread a reminder of how far I'd fallen. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time I'd felt safe, really safe. My mother's hands brushing hair from my forehead, my father's laughter echoing off the walls of our old kitchen. But those memories felt like someone else's life, now a story I'd heard once, and forgotten the ending. I curled up on the bed, pulling the thin blanket around me like armor. My mind wouldn't stop replaying their words. You'll be alone. You'll always be alone. But under the weight of that memory, something else began to flicker to life. A stubborn, flickering flame of something like defiance. I thought of the house, their house where I'd grown up. Every corner of it still smelled of Sunday dinners, and birthdays, and quiet mornings spent watching the world outside the window. They thought they'd cut me out of that story, but they didn't understand it was my story too. The walls held my laughter. The floors remembered my footsteps. That house wasn't just a place, it was a promise I'd made to myself a long time ago. One day, I'll come back. I didn't know how yet. I didn't have a plan or a penny to my name beyond the coins in my coat pocket, but I had the memory of that promise, and I clung to it like a life raft in a storm. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy with the scent of wet earth and old regrets. I left the motel early, walking the streets like a ghost, watching the world move on without me. People hurried past, heads down, umbrellas up their lives so loud I could almost forget how quiet mine had become. I found a diner that didn't mind if I nursed a cup of coffee for hours. The waitress gave me a look of pity when I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, but she didn't say anything. I sat there, hands wrapped around the warm mug, and watched the world through the rain-streaked window. Every face that passed was a reminder, you're alone now. But I wasn't done. I started looking for work that day, anything that would keep me moving forward. I scrubbed floors in the back of a greasy spoon-folded sheets in a rundown motel, stacked shelves in the dusty corners of a secondhand bookstore. The jobs paid next to nothing, but every dollar was another step away from the night I walked out that door. Every bruise on my palms, every ache in my back was proof that I was still here, still fighting. At night, I lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the siren's wail, the soft murmur of people who didn't know my name. And in that darkness, I whispered my promise to the ceiling: I will not be forgotten. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning, because I wasn't even sure myself. But in the quiet hours when exhaustion blurred the edges of the world, I saw the house in my mind's eye. I saw the door, the cracked paint, the front porch sagging under the weight of years. I saw it waiting for me, patient and silent, like it knew I'd find my way back. One night, as I walked home from another late shift, I paused on the sidewalk and looked up at the sky. The moon was just a sliver, the stars hidden behind clouds. But I felt something inside me shift like the turning of a tide. I realized then, loneliness wasn't a curse, it was a crucible. And I was being forged in it, tempered by every hard day, every cold night. They said I'd be alone. Maybe they were right. But they didn't know what I'd become in the quiet. They didn't know that the girl they'd turned away was building something stronger than they could ever imagine. I took a deep breath and kept walking. My story wasn't over yet. The days began to blur together, one folding into the next, like pages in a book I couldn't stop reading. I woke up each morning with the ache of exhaustion still clinging to my bones, but I pushed it away. The sun rose, and so did I. Each day was another chance to prove to myself and to them that I wouldn't disappear into the shadows they left me in. The jobs were never easy. I cleaned bathrooms until my hands cracked from the bleach. I carried boxes until my shoulders screamed in protest. My nails broke and my skin turned rough, but I never let that stop me. The pain was a small price to pay for the quiet knowledge that I was moving forward, even if the world didn't notice. At night, I'd find a corner of the room to sit in, knees drawn up to my chest, and I'd let myself feel the weight of it all. The weight of their words, "You'll be alone." The weight of my memories' birthdays in that old house, laughter echoing off the walls, the smell of cinnamon and vanilla in the kitchen. It was like a phantom limb, something I'd lost, but could still feel as if it were right there. I let those memories hurt. I let them cut deep because I knew the only way through was to face them head on. I refused to let them become just another reason to give up. Sometimes when the city went quiet and the night grew still, I'd close my eyes and see that house in my mind. I'd see the peeling paint, the ivy creeping up the porch columns, the cracked steps that had carried me up and down through years of childhood. I'd see the kitchen window where my mother used to stand, humming softly to herself as she made dinner. I'd see my father's chair by the fireplace, his laugh rumbling like thunder in a storm. I held those images close, not because they made me sad, but because they reminded me of who I was before they told me I wasn't enough. One evening, after a long shift at the diner, I found myself lingering by the window, my fingers absently tracing the condensation on the glass. Outside, the world was painted in street lamp gold and soft shadows, and for a moment, I almost believed I could still find my way back to the life I'd lost. The bell above the door jingled as a man in a dark coat slipped inside. He had kind eyes, the sort that seemed to see more than just the surface. He ordered a coffee and sat down at the counter, and when our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. It was nothing, just a polite gesture to a stranger, but in that tiny moment, I felt seen. And it was enough to remind me that I wasn't invisible, no matter how many times they tried to make me believe it. The night ended like every other tired sore, but still standing. I counted my tips carefully, every coin and crumpled bill a testament to my stubborn will. I folded them into the envelope I kept in my coat pocket, the one labeled "Someday" in shaky handwriting. It wasn't much, but it was growing dollar by dollar, and it was mine. One morning as I walked to work, I passed by a notice board in the neighborhood square. A flyer caught my eye: estate sale, old family home, must sell fast. My breath caught in my throat as I read the address. It was the house. My house. The one they'd pushed me out of, the one they said would never be mine again. I stood there, my heart beating so loudly I could feel it in my fingertips. The words on that paper burned themselves into my mind: must sell fast. They were getting rid of it, probably for pennies on the dollar. I felt a surge of something electric and dangerous hope. Raw, unfiltered hope that crackled through me like lightning. I didn't have enough money yet. I knew that. But I also knew I couldn't let that house go to someone else. It wasn't just a building, it was the last piece of a life they tried to erase. It was proof that I'd been there, that I mattered. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the words of that flyer echoing in my mind. Must sell fast. I imagined the house stripped of all its history, the memories painted over and locked away. The thought made my chest ache, but it also lit a fire in my belly. I started working harder, picking up extra shifts wherever I could. I learned to live on coffee and determination, my body moving on pure adrenaline. My world shrank down to the glow of the diner's kitchen, the dusty shelves of the bookstore, the quiet hush of the night streets. Every dollar I made went straight into that envelope. Every time my hands ached or my back tensed with pain, I told myself it's worth it. Because one day I'd stand on that porch again. One day I'd turn the key in the lock and know that I'd done what they said was impossible. People started to notice the change in me. The regulars at the diner would watch me with something like respect in their eyes. The old man at the bookstore offered me a second job stacking boxes in the back room. They didn't know my story, but they could see the fire in my eyes. They could see that I was reaching for something bigger than the bruises on my palms. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. My body grew stronger, leaner. My mind sharpened, fueled by the quiet certainty that I wasn't just surviving, I was building something. Piece by piece, hour by hour, I was taking back what was mine. And even on the nights when the city seemed too big, too cold, I held on to the memory of that house like a talisman. I whispered to myself over and over, like a prayer, "You are not alone. You are not forgotten." They said I'd be alone, but in the spaces between the work and the worry, in the heartbeat of every quiet moment, I began to feel something shift. I began to see that loneliness wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of it. And so I kept going, because I knew deep down in my bones that the day would come when I'd stand on that porch again. And when it did, I wouldn't be asking for permission, I'd be taking back what was always mine. The days grew shorter, and the nights seemed to stretch on forever. I found a rhythm in the long hours, a steady beat of work and survival that kept my mind too busy for doubt. My muscles grew accustomed to the strain, my hands rough with calluses that spoke of every hour I'd traded for a few crumpled bills. It was a hard life, but it was mine. And every step forward was another reminder that I hadn't been defeated. Still, the nights were the hardest. When the world went quiet, and the only sounds were the groaning pipes of my tiny room, the memories would sneak back in. I'd close my eyes and see that house, every detail etched into my mind like a map. The cracked tiles in the hallway, the dusty scent of the attic, the way the morning light had once filtered through the kitchen curtains. It was more than a memory, it was an anchor, something that kept me steady when everything else threatened to pull me under. I clung to that image with a desperation I didn't dare admit even to myself. Because that house wasn't just a building, it was the last place I'd felt like I belonged. And no matter how many times I told myself I was done needing them, some small part of me still wanted that sense of home. One night, after a late shift at the bookstore, I found myself standing at the end of the block, staring up at the house from across the street. It looked the same as it always had, though maybe a little more worn around the edges. The ivy had crept higher, the porch steps sagged a bit more, but it was still there, still holding every ghost of who I used to be. I watched the windows glow with warm light, the laughter of strangers echoing softly into the night. It wasn't mine anymore, but it still felt like it should be. I wondered who lived there now, what stories they were telling inside those walls. And for a moment, I let myself imagine slipping back into a life that had never been mine to keep. I shook the thought away before it could take root. I turned and walked back to my tiny room, the cold night air biting at my skin. Each step felt like a battle, but I kept walking because I had no other choice. In the days that followed, I pushed harder. I picked up every extra shift I could find, learned to move faster, work harder. I stopped counting the hours. It didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the envelope in my coat pocket growing heavier with each payday. It was a small, silent rebellion against everything they'd said about me. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the early morning, I'd catch sight of myself in the mirror. My reflection startled me. There was someone new in those eyes. Someone who had learned to bend, but not to break. The girl who had once been too soft, too trusting, was gone. In her place was someone who knew exactly what she wanted and exactly how far she'd go to get it. One evening, the old man at the bookstore asked me if I ever took a day off. I just shrugged and smiled, but inside, I wanted to tell him that rest was a luxury I couldn't afford. That every minute I wasn't working was another minute lost. I couldn't explain it, not really, not the way that house still called to me, not the way their laughter still echoed in my head like a dare. I kept to myself, mostly head down, focused. But even in my solitude, I started to notice the small kindnesses that came my way. The waitress at the diner, who slipped an extra roll onto my plate when she thought I wasn't looking. The old man at the bookstore who left the back door unlocked on cold nights so I'd have a warm place to stand for a few minutes. These small gestures were like threads of light in the darkness, reminders that maybe not everyone saw me the way they did. And through it all, that flyer from the notice board burned in my mind. Estate sale, old family home, must sell fast. I read it over and over until the words became a promise. I didn't know how, but I knew I'd find a way to make it mine again. It wasn't just about the house. It was about proving to myself that I was more than what they tried to make me believe. One rainy afternoon, I stopped by the bank to ask about loans. The man behind the desk looked me up and down, his polite smile never quite reaching his eyes. He told me the numbers didn't add up, that people like me didn't get to own homes like that. I thanked him for his time and walked out with my head held high, even though my stomach was twisting into knots. I refused to let his doubt become my own. I'd come too far to let anyone else's disbelief hold me back. That night, I sat at the window in my room, watching the rain streak down the glass. My fingers traced the patterns of the drops, and I whispered to myself, "You're not done. This isn't the end." It became my mantra, a quiet vow that kept me moving forward, even when everything else felt impossible. Every day, I felt the weight of their words, "You'll be alone." But I also felt the weight of every hour I'd worked, every dollar I'd saved, every blister and bruise that had built this new life. And slowly, I realized that maybe they were right about one thing: I was alone. But that didn't mean I was powerless. I started to see that there was a kind of freedom in being alone. No one to answer to, no one to tell me I couldn't. It was just me, and that was enough. And as I lay in bed that night, the city humming softly outside my window, I knew that the house wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a goal, a promise, a testament to everything I'd survived. I closed my eyes and saw it again, the chipped paint, the ivy, the worn steps that had carried me from childhood to exile. And I promised myself that one day I'd stand there again, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as the owner. The one who'd come back stronger than they'd ever imagined. The world outside might have been dark and cold, but inside me, something was burning bright. And I knew I wouldn't stop until I held those keys in my hand. Each dawn broke over the city with the same gray light, but to me, every sunrise was a quiet dare to keep going. The work didn't get easier, and my body never stopped aching, but I'd learned how to bend without breaking. My days were a blur of worn-out sneakers, aching feet, and the slow, steady rhythm of determination that carried me forward, one breath at a time. The small room I rented felt more like a safe house than a home, a place to catch my breath before heading back into the world. It smelled faintly of old paint and stale air, but at night I'd curl up under the thin blanket and let my mind wander back to that house. I could see every detail: the squeak of the floorboards in the hall, the faint scent of cedar from the closet, the kitchen where my mother's laughter used to dance in the air. I clung to those memories, not as a comfort, but as a blueprint, a silent reminder that what once felt out of reach was still waiting for me. The more I thought about the house, the more real it became in my mind. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was a plan. And like every plan, it needed a map. So I started learning everything I could about buying property. In stolen moments between shifts, I'd pore over books in the library, scribbling notes on napkins and scraps of paper. I learned about down payments, credit scores, mortgages, and the million tiny ways the world told people like me to stay in our place. But I also learned that determination could be more powerful than money if you were willing to work for it. Sometimes the weight of it all felt like it would crush me. I'd be stacking books at the store or wiping down counters at the diner, and I'd feel the doubt creeping in soft and insidious. It would whisper in the back of my mind, "You're just a girl with nothing but a dream." But I'd swallow it down and let my resolve speak louder. I'm more than they'll ever know. I started taking on every job I could find, cleaning apartments, stocking shelves, even hauling boxes in the cold for a moving company. My hands grew rougher, my back stiffer, but my envelope labeled "Someday" grew thicker. Each dollar was a small victory, a tangible step closer to the promise I'd made to myself. One evening, after a shift that stretched long into the night, I found myself standing in front of the old house again. My clothes were damp with sweat and rain, my hair plastered to my forehead. But I didn't care. The porch light was off, and the windows stared back at me like dark eyes. I wondered if the house remembered me the way I remembered it, if it felt my steps on the sidewalk and waited for me to come home. A sudden gust of wind sent a shiver down my spine, but I stayed there, fingers curling around the straps of my bag like a lifeline. In that moment, I wasn't a waitress or a cashier, or the girl who'd been told she'd be alone. I was someone who refused to be forgotten, someone who would stand in the dark until she found her way back to the light. The next morning, I woke with a plan humming in my veins. I tracked down every lead I could find on the house. Old records, for sale signs whispered rumors. I asked questions even when people looked at me like I was crazy. I learned that the family wanted to sell fast, that they were tired of the upkeep, that they wanted it gone. I learned that they didn't see the value in those walls, the stories woven into the wood and stone. But I did. I saved every cent I could, cutting corners and skipping meals when I had to. I learned to live on black coffee and sheer willpower, my body fueled by the fire of a dream I couldn't shake. At night, I'd count my tips and whisper to myself, one day. One day. It was more than a wish, it was a promise. There were setbacks, of course. Times when the money ran low or the hours dried up. Times when I'd stare at the envelope in my pocket and wonder if I was just chasing ghosts. But each time the doubt crept in, I thought of that house, of the laughter it once held, of the girl I used to be, and the woman I was becoming. And I knew I couldn't stop. In the quiet moments, I found strength in the smallest things. The way the morning light crept through the diner's windows, soft and forgiving. The kind smile of the old man at the bookstore when he handed me an extra shift. The worn pages of the books, I stacked each story, a testament to survival, to hope. I stopped looking at the world as a series of closed doors. Instead, I saw cracks in the walls, chances to slip through to carve my own path. I wasn't just working, I was building a bridge back to the place I'd been forced to leave behind. One cold afternoon, as I walked back from yet another shift, I paused in front of the bank. The glass doors gleamed, reflecting the world outside. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, my heart pounding like a drumbeat in my chest. I asked about what I'd need for a loan, what steps I'd have to take. The banker's polite smile didn't reach his eyes, but I didn't care. I didn't expect him to believe in me. I just needed to believe in myself. He handed me a stack of paperwork, and I took it home like a trophy. I spread it out on my tiny table, tracing the words with my fingertips. It felt impossible, overwhelming, but I knew I'd find a way. Because I had to. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every time they'd told me I couldn't. Every time they'd tried to write me out of my own story. As the days turned to weeks, I found new ways to keep going. I borrowed books on budgeting and real estate, scrawling notes in the margins, like a secret map to a life they never thought I'd claim. I learned the language of interest rates and down payments, of credit scores and closing costs. It was a world I'd never imagined myself a part of, but I was determined to make it mine. I didn't know how long it would take, or how many more nights I'd spend staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was strong enough. But I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer the girl they'd turned away. I was stronger now, forged in the quiet hours and the weight of every dollar saved. And with each breath, each step, I was drawing closer to the place where my story would finally be written in my own hand. And as the city settled into the hush of night, I lay awake with a quiet smile, knowing that the seeds I was planting now would one day bloom into something bigger than they'd ever dared to imagine. The cold of winter seeped into every crack of the city, but inside me there was a fire that wouldn't go out. I worked through the holidays, through the icy winds that rattled the diner's windows, and the snow that turned the streets into a maze of white. My breath fogged in the air as I carried boxes and scrubbed floors, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every dollar I earned was another brick in the foundation of the life I was building. The envelope in my coat pocket grew fat, the weight of it, a constant reminder that I wasn't working for nothing. I was working for the house, the one they said I'd never see again. Late at night, I'd sit in my small room and count the bills by the flickering light of a single lamp. My fingers moved slow and careful, each crease in the paper, a testament to how far I'd come. And each time I finished, I'd slip the envelope back into my pocket, close my eyes, and see that house in my mind, standing there, waiting. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. It was easier that way. No questions, no doubts, no one to tell me I was crazy for thinking I could pull this off. I carried it all inside, let it grow into a quiet resolve that carried me through the hardest days. Then, one morning, as I was wiping down the counter at the diner, a man in a suit walked in. He looked out of place among the regulars, his coat too fine for the worn vinyl booths, and the smell of cheap coffee. He ordered a coffee to go, but his eyes kept drifting over to where I was working. I felt them like a weight, a silent question in the air. When he left, he paused by the counter. "You're the girl who grew up in that old house on Maple Street, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and measured. My hands froze on the rag I was holding. I looked up, meeting his eyes squarely. "I am," I said, my voice steady. He gave me a small smile, but there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. "I thought so," he said, slipping a business card across the counter. "If you're interested in buying it back, you should know they're selling soon. Could be a good deal for the right buyer." My fingers closed around the card, the slick paper cool against my skin. He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and walked out into the cold, leaving the door to swing shut behind him. I stood there, the rag still in my hand, my mind racing. I didn't know who he was or why he cared, but his words lit a spark in my chest that burned bright and hot. That night, I sat at my little table and traced the letters on the card. Real estate consultant. His name printed in neat, sharp type. It felt like a sign, a crack in the wall I'd been banging my fists against for months. Maybe this was the chance I'd been waiting for. The next day, I called the number. My hands shook as I dialed, my heart thundering in my chest. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and professional. "I want to know more about the house," I said, trying to keep my voice from trembling. He told me everything he knew, the asking price, the state of the property, the rumors that the family was desperate to sell. My mind spun with the numbers, the possibilities. It felt like a puzzle I'd been working on in the dark, and suddenly someone had turned on the light. "I don't have much," I said quietly, "but I have something, and I'm willing to fight for it." There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. "Sometimes that's all it takes," he said. "I'll set up a meeting. Be ready." I was. In the days that followed, I worked harder than I ever had before. Every spare minute was spent poring over the paperwork he sent me, learning the language of appraisals and inspections of closing costs and contingencies. I scribbled notes in the margins, questions to ask, and things to remember. My world shrank down to the size of that house, every thought, every breath tied to the dream of seeing it again. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning. I stood outside the real estate office in my best clothes, my hair pulled back, and my hands tucked into my coat pockets to keep them from shaking. When I walked in, the man in the suit was waiting for me. He smiled when he saw me, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. He walked me through the numbers, the terms, the timeline. I nodded, asked questions, took notes like my life depended on it, because in a way, it did. This wasn't just about a house. It was about proving to myself that I could take back what they'd tried to steal from me. At the end of the meeting, he leaned back in his chair and studied me. "You're serious about this," he said, not a question, but a statement. I met his gaze squarely. "I am." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Then let's make it happen." Walking out of that office, I felt taller than I had in years. My steps were lighter, my breath easier. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the world was opening up in front of me instead of closing in. Of course, there was still so much to do. I'd need more money, more paperwork, more grit than I'd ever thought possible. But for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. It felt like a mountain I was already climbing, one hand over the other, never stopping, never giving up. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the girl I'd been when I left that house. The girl who'd walked out with nothing but a suitcase and a head full of doubt. I thought about her, and I whispered to the dark, "You're not that girl anymore. You're stronger now. You're ready." And in the quiet of the night, with the city breathing softly around me, I believed it. The weeks that followed were a blur of motion and exhaustion. My life had become a carefully balanced dance, every hour at the diner, every dollar from the bookstore, every favor I could trade or small job I could find. The city felt colder, the nights longer, but I didn't let that slow me down. Each breath I took was laced with determination. Each step was a promise to myself I would see this through. The real estate agent's calls became a part of my routine. I'd take them on my breaks, ducking into alleyways or standing in the back room of the diner, my heart pounding in my chest. He spoke in the clipped language of negotiations and closing terms, and I scribbled it all down like a lifeline. Every time I hung up, I felt a little closer to that house. But there were setbacks, too. One day, he told me another buyer had put in an offer. My stomach dropped to the floor. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears as he explained that it wasn't final, that I still had a chance. But the thought of losing that house to someone else was like a knife twisting in my chest. I worked harder. I took double shifts whenever I could, sleeping only a few hours before getting up to do it all over again. My feet ached constantly, and there were days when I felt like I might collapse under the weight of it all. But each time doubt crept in, I pushed it away. I wasn't doing this just to prove them wrong. I was doing it to prove to myself that I was worth the fight. The city had a way of feeling endless, like its streets stretched on forever. But I found small moments of peace sitting in the library, with a stack of real estate books, the quiet hush of turning pages grounding me. Or leaning against the diner's counter, during a rare lull, watching the snowflakes drift lazily past the window. Those small moments reminded me that even in the chaos, there was still beauty to be found. One night, after a particularly long shift, I walked by the house again. It was quiet, the porch light casting long shadows across the steps. I stood on the sidewalk, my breath visible in the cold night air, and let myself imagine it. The soft creak of the floorboards, the smell of wood smoke and old memories, the laughter that had once filled those walls. I reached out and touched the cold iron of the gate, my fingers curling around it, like I was afraid it might slip away. In that moment, I made a silent promise I wasn't going to let anyone else take it from me. I would find a way, no matter what. The next day, the banker called. My loan application had hit a snag, something about my credit, my lack of collateral. His voice was apologetic, but I could hear the finality in it. I hung up the phone and just stood there, the world suddenly too loud and too bright. For a moment, I let myself feel the weight of it all. The exhaustion, the fear, the quiet voice in the back of my mind that whispered, maybe they'd been right all along. But I didn't let it stay. I took a deep breath and pushed those thoughts away. I didn't have the luxury of giving up. I went back to the diner that night, wiped down the tables, refilled the sugar jars, and told myself that this was just another hurdle. I'd find a way around it. A few days later, I found an ad in the paper, an opportunity for part-time work cleaning offices at night. It paid better than anything else I'd found, and I jumped at it. My days became a blur of coffee and calluses of one job rolling into the next. My body was tired in ways I didn't have words for, but my spirit felt sharper than ever. Sometimes, when I lay down at night, my muscles ached so bad I couldn't sleep. But in those dark hours, I'd close my eyes and see the house. I'd see the porch bathed in the morning sun, the way the ivy climbed up the walls like it was reaching for the sky. And I'd remember why I was fighting. I started keeping a notebook by my bed, filling it with plans and ideas, ways to cut corners, ways to earn more. It was messy pages filled with scribbles and crossed out lines. But it was mine. My map forward my proof that I wasn't just dreaming I was doing. One particularly cold night, as I walked home from the office cleaning job, I passed a window and caught sight of my reflection. I almost didn't recognize the girl staring back at me. Her eyes were tired but fierce, her shoulders straighter than they'd ever been. There were dark circles under her eyes and lines of worry around her mouth, but there was also a spark there, a quiet, unyielding fire. I paused, pressing my hand to the cold glass. "You're not done," I whispered. "You're just getting started." A few days later, the real estate agent called again. His voice was warm, almost excited. "The other buyer backed out," he said. "If you're ready, the house can be yours." I felt like the world had gone silent around me, every sound fading into nothing but the rush of blood in my ears. My hand shook as I pressed the phone tighter. "I'm ready," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. "Good," he said. "Then let's make it official." When I hung up, I stood in the middle of my tiny room, the envelope of money clutched in my hands. I thought about everything it had taken to get here, every long night, every moment of doubt, every time I'd been told I'd never make it. And I realized that no matter what happened next, I'd already proven something important. I was stronger than their doubts, stronger than my own fear. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding with a mix of terror and excitement. I knew the real work was just beginning, but for the first time, it didn't scare me. Because I'd already faced the worst of it, the loneliness, the rejection, the endless nights of wondering if I was enough. And I'd survived. The morning of the closing felt like the city itself was holding its breath. The winter air was sharp and bright, the sky the color of ice. I woke before dawn, too restless to sleep, and watched the first light slip through the cracks of my curtain. My hands were already shaking, but it wasn't from the cold, it was from the weight of everything that lay ahead. I dressed carefully, pulling on the nicest clothes I owned. They weren't new, but they were clean and pressed, and they made me feel like I was stepping into a new skin. In the mirror, I saw the woman I'd become, her eyes steady, her shoulders squared. I took a deep breath, squared my jaw, and whispered, "This is yours now. Take it." The real estate office was a small brick building on the edge of downtown, the kind of place you'd walk by 100 times without noticing. But to me, it might as well have been a palace. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my fingers, tightening around the handle of my bag inside it, the envelope of money I'd spent months building, the tangible proof of every hour I'd worked and every night I hadn't slept. The man in the suit was already there, waiting. He smiled when he saw me, a real smile this time, one that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You made it," he said softly. "I did," I said, my voice steady. "I'm ready." He nodded and led me back to a small conference room where the paperwork was already spread out across the table. The legal language swirled across the pages in tight, crisp letters. My heart pounded as I sat down, my hands resting flat on the cool surface. This was it, the moment I'd been fighting for since the day I'd walked away, with nothing but a suitcase and a promise to myself. As he walked me through each page, explaining the terms and the fine print, I forced myself to focus. I couldn't afford to miss a single detail. Every signature I scrawled felt like a hammer, striking the final nail into the coffin of everything they'd said about me. Every doubt, every cruel word, every time they'd told me I'd never be enough. When it was done, he slid the last page across the table, his voice low and reverent. "Sign here," he said. "And it's yours." My hand shook as I pressed the pen to the paper, but I didn't pause. I signed my name letter by careful letter, And when I set the pen down, I felt something shift inside me. Like a door had opened, and for the first time, I was the one holding the key. He stood and held out his hand. "Congratulations," he said, his smile warm. "You're a homeowner now." I took his hand, my grip firm, and for a moment, we just stood there, me, the girl they said would never be anything, and him, the man who'd helped me prove them all wrong. The world felt impossibly bright. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I clutched the keys in my hand, the metal biting into my palm, and felt a laugh bubble up in my chest. I couldn't stop smiling. The house was mine, mine. I walked there instead of taking the bus, needing to feel the city under my feet, to mark every step of this new beginning. My breath clouded the air, but I barely noticed. I was too busy thinking about what came next, about the work that still lay ahead, the walls that needed patching, the memories waiting to be remade. When I reached the house, I paused at the gate, the iron cold and familiar under my fingers. For a long moment, I just stood there looking up at the place that had shaped so much of who I was. The porch sagged a little more than I remembered, the paint peeling back in long curling strips. But to me, it was beautiful. I stepped forward and slid the key into the lock, my heart thundering in my chest. The door swung open on a breath of stale air and dust, the smell of old wood and quiet dreams. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, leaning back against it as I let the silence wash over me. The house was empty, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like a blank canvas-like possibility. I walked through each room slowly, my fingers trailing over the walls, the window frames, the chipped doorways. Every creak of the floorboards was a welcome, every gust of cold air a reminder that I was home. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, remembering the way it used to smell of cinnamon and sugar, the way my mother used to hum as she worked at the stove. I closed my eyes and let the memories flood in, not to mourn them, but to honor them. Because now they were part of something new. I spent the rest of the day cleaning, sweeping away years of dust and cobwebs, opening the windows to let in the crisp air. My muscles burned, but I didn't stop. This was my house now, and I wanted it to know me the way I knew it, every crack and creak, every patch of light and shadow. As the sun set and the first stars winked to life in the darkening sky, I stood in the doorway and looked out at the street. The city seemed quieter somehow, the night softer around the edges. I took a deep breath and let it fill my lungs, let it settle into the spaces that had ached for so long. I knew there was still work to be done. The house needed fixing, and so did I. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the work. I was ready for it. Because every scraped knuckle and every blister was a mark of how far I'd come and how much further I was willing to go. I turned back inside, closed the door, and locked it behind me. The house was mine. And as I stood there in the dark, the keys still clutched tight in my hand, I realized something else too. I wasn't alone anymore. The first night in the house was a strange mix of silence and memory. I lay on the floor in a sleeping bag, the bare boards creaking softly beneath me. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes like a restless ghost. But inside it was calm, like the house was holding its breath, waiting to see if I'd really come back to stay. I listened to the quiet, my eyes tracing the shapes the moonlight made on the ceiling. Every sound was familiar, the groan of the old pipes, the soft sigh of the wind slipping through the eaves. But there was something new, too, a sense of belonging, of rightness, that settled over me like a warm blanket. I slept fitfully, dreams filled with laughter, and footsteps echoing down long hallways. When I woke, the early morning light was already spilling through the cracked curtains, painting the room in soft gold. For a moment, I just lay there, breathing in the dusty air, feeling the weight of the keys still tucked under my pillow. I spent the morning cleaning. The house had been empty for too long, and dust clung to every surface, a soft gray film that dulled the edges of everything. I opened every window, let the cold winter air rush in and sweep away the stale scent of the past. My hands worked without pause, scrubbing floors, wiping down walls, sweeping away the cobwebs that had taken up residence in the corners. As I worked, I felt the house waking up around me. With every bucket of dirty water I carried out, every rag turned black with grime, I felt the weight of the years lifting. The walls seemed to breathe easier, the air fresher, the rooms brighter. It wasn't just cleaning, it was claiming, reclaiming. In the afternoons, I'd take a break and sit on the porch steps, the cold seeping through my jeans, but I didn't care. I'd watch the street, the slow drift of snowflakes, and the pale winter sun. Sometimes neighbors would pass by, their eyes curious, but no one stopped to ask questions. I liked it that way. This was my story to tell in my own time. I found an old radio in the attic, dusty but still working. At night, I'd sit in the kitchen and let the crackling music fill the empty spaces, the soft hum of old songs weaving through the rooms like a promise. The warmth of the melody, the flickering candle on the table, it was enough to make the house feel like a home, even if only for a little while. But the past had a way of creeping back in. One evening, as I was painting over the water stains on the living room ceiling, there was a knock at the door. I froze the roller in my hand, dripping white paint onto the drop cloth. For a moment, my mind went blank, every memory of why I'd fought so hard to be here, colliding with the fear that maybe somehow it could all be taken away again. I set the roller down and wiped my hands on my jeans before opening the door. My brother stood there, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes shifting from the cracked steps to the freshly painted trim. He looked older than I remembered, the lines on his face, deeper. His shoulders hunched like he was carrying a weight he couldn't put down. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. I stepped aside and he walked in, his boots thumping softly against the floor. He looked around, his gaze lingering on the clean walls, the bright windows. "You've done a lot," he said finally, his voice tight. I nodded. It needed it. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands fidgeting. "I heard you bought it back," he said. "I didn't think you'd really do it." I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "I told you I would." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He paused, the words catching in his throat. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry, for everything." I felt the words settle in the room, like dust, soft and heavy. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at him, really looked, and saw the boy I used to play tag with in the yard, the brother who used to make me laugh until my stomach hurt. But I also saw the man who had stood by while they turned me out, who had let their silence speak louder than any apology. "I know," I said finally, my voice quiet. "But that was then. This is now." He nodded, his shoulders sagging. "Do you need anything I could?" "No," I said, gentle but firm. "I'm okay." He hesitated, then nodded again. He looked around one more time, his eyes soft. "It's good what you're doing here," he said. It's good to see you making it yours." "Thanks," I said. And I meant it. When he left, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the cold air biting at my skin. I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief, like a chapter had finally been closed. I turned back inside the house, quiet and waiting, and I knew whatever came next, this was mine to shape. That night, I sat by the window and watched the snowfall, the flakes drifting soft and slow through the glow of the street lamp. I thought about everything it had taken to get here, the nights spent working, until I couldn't stand the doubt that had crept in like frost, the fire that had kept me going even when the world told me to quit. And I thought about the future, the rooms still waiting to be filled, the walls still waiting to be painted. I thought about the laughter I'd bring back to these halls, the warmth I'd build with my own two hands. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the house wash over me, and in that quiet, I made another promise to myself. You've come this far. Don't stop now. Because this house wasn't just a place. It was a testament to resilience, to hope, to the simple, unshakable truth that no matter what they said, I wasn't alone, and I never would be again. The days that followed felt like the slow unfolding of something new. Each morning, I woke up to the creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet, the soft chill of winter air seeping through the cracks. But I didn't mind. This was my house now, my sanctuary, my battlefield, my quiet triumph. I spent every free moment working on the rooms, scrubbing away the years of neglect, painting over the stains of a past that no longer belonged to me. My hands were rough and raw from the effort, but there was a kind of peace in the ache. With every stroke of the brush, every nail I hammered in, I was rewriting the story of this place and of myself. The kitchen was the first room to come alive. I stripped the faded wallpaper and painted the walls a soft, warm cream. The cabinets were old and battered, but I sanded them smooth and gave them a fresh coat of paint, watching them transform beneath my fingers. At night, I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, listening to the radio hum softly in the corner, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings in the air. It was a small thing, but it felt like hope. One evening, as I was cleaning out the attic, I found an old box of photographs tucked away in the corner. My heart twisted as I opened it, the scent of old paper and dust rising up to greet me. Inside were pictures of a life I'd almost forgotten, birthdays and holidays, my mother's warm smile, my brother's laughter frozen in a moment of childhood mischief. I sat there for a long time, the box open in my lap, the memories washing over me in soft, bittersweet waves. There was a part of me that wanted to shut the box and shove it back into the dark to let the past stay buried. But another part of me, a braver part, knew that these memories were part of the house, part of me. I couldn't hide from them forever, so I kept the box. I set it on a shelf in the living room, a small altar, to everything I'd been and everything I was becoming. The house seemed to sigh in relief, like it was glad I wasn't trying to erase what had come before. But not all ghosts were so easy to make peace with. One cold morning, there was a knock at the door. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened it to find my sister-in-law standing there, her face pale and drawn. She looked around her eyes, flickering over the fresh paint, the new curtains I'd hung in the front windows. "You've done a lot," she said quietly. I nodded my jaw tight. It needed it. She hesitated, her fingers twisting together. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry for the things I said, for not standing up for you when I should have." I studied her face, searching for the girl I'd once trusted, the woman who had watched me walk away and hadn't tried to stop me. I saw regret there, and something like shame, but I also saw fear, the fear of what forgiveness might mean. "I appreciate that," I said finally, "but I'm not the same person I was." She nodded, her shoulders slumping a little. "I know, I can see that." We stood there in the cold, the silence stretching out between us. I didn't invite her in, and she didn't ask. Some things were better left outside. When she left, I closed the door and leaned against it, my hands pressed flat against the wood. My heart was beating hard in my chest, but I didn't feel small or afraid. I felt whole, like I'd finally found the strength to stand in the doorway of my own life and say, "This is mine. You don't get to take it from me anymore." The house seemed to echo that feeling. As I moved through the rooms, I felt the past settling into place, not as a weight, but as a foundation. Every memory, every crack in the plaster and scuff on the floor was a testament to survival, to the fact that I was still here. At night, I'd sit in the living room with a single lamp burning the soft glow, making the freshly painted walls feel warm and safe. I'd listen to the old radio and let my mind wander, dreaming of the meals I'd cook in the kitchen, the laughter that would one day fill these rooms again. But there were still moments of doubt. Late at night, when the wind howled outside and the house creaked in the dark, I'd feel it, the old fear, the whispered voices of the past, telling me I'd never be enough. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling and wonder if maybe they'd been right. And then I'd remember everything it had taken to get here. The nights spent working until my hands were numb, the mornings I woke with a weight in my chest, but got up anyway. The keys in my hand, the fresh paint on the walls, the quiet certainty in my bones that I'd earned every inch of this life. I'd close my eyes and whisper to the dark, "You were wrong." And in the silence that followed, I'd hear the house breathe with me, the echo of those words settling into the bones of the place like a promise. I knew there would be more to come, more work, more memories to build, more ghosts to lay to rest. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the future. I wasn't afraid of the echoes of the past, because I knew now that I was stronger than any doubt, any whisper, any memory that tried to tell me I wasn't enough. This was my house, my story, my chance to prove that even the deepest wounds could become something beautiful. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, the quiet of the house wrapping around me like a blanket, I knew one thing for certain: I was home. The days grew a little longer, the winter sun hanging in the sky like a promise. Each morning, I woke to the pale light creeping through the old curtains, the house warming slowly around me. It was a small miracle watching the frost melt from the windows as the heat of my breath turned the air soft and alive. I threw myself into the work of making the house truly mine. The kitchen became my sanctuary first, the room that felt most like home. I found an old table at a thrift store and sanded it down until the wood shone like honey. I sewed new curtains from scrap fabric, cheerful, in a way that made the whole room feel like it was smiling. The clatter of dishes, the smell of fresh coffee. These small things wove themselves together like threads in a new tapestry. Neighbors began to notice the changes. Mrs. Foster from next door would sometimes wave at me from her porch, her eyes kind and curious. Once she stopped me as I was coming back from the hardware store, her arms full of groceries. "It's good to see someone bringing life back into that old place," she said, her smile warm. "It's been too quiet for too long." "Thank you," I said, my voice soft but sure. "It feels right being here." "It suits you," she said, and I held on to those words like a charm. The repairs weren't easy. Every project seemed to reveal another layer of wear, another hidden crack or creak. Some nights I'd collapse into bed, my muscles screaming, my hands raw from scrubbing and painting. But in the quiet dark, I'd feel a different kind of tired, the good kind. The kind that comes from building something with your own two hands. One afternoon, I found myself in the backyard, the small patch of earth, hard and unyielding beneath the frost. I knelt in the dirt, my breath fogging in the cold, and pulled away the dead weeds and tangled roots. My fingers stung, but I kept going, the rhythm of the work steady and grounding. It felt like tending to something deep and old, like coaxing life from the cold earth. I planted bulbs, daffodils, and tulips, and tiny crocuses, pressing them into the soil with quiet hope. They were small, fragile things, but I liked to think that come spring, they'd burst forth in a riot of color, a sign that this place was alive again. As I worked, I thought about the house and the way it had stood silent for so long. I thought about how I'd once been like that, my voice buried under the weight of other people's doubt. Now, with every seed pressed into the earth, I felt like I was planting pieces of myself, two small, stubborn hopes that refused to be crushed. Inside, I found new ways to make the house feel like mine. I painted the bedroom walls a soft, calming blue, the color of the sky just before dawn. I hung shelves and filled them with books I'd collected from thrift stores and yard sale stories that felt like old friends keeping me company. Sometimes when the nights grew long and the wind rattled the windows, I'd pull a chair up to the front window and watch the world outside. I'd see the glow of streetlights, the occasional car rolling by, the hush of snow falling soft and steady. In those quiet hours, I felt the weight of the past loosening its grip, the house settling around me like it had been waiting for me all along. One evening, I found an old record player in the attic, dusty and silent. I cleaned it up, coaxing it back to life, and set it on a table in the corner of the living room. When I dropped the needle on a record, the scratchy music filled the air like magic. The soft crackle and pop of vinyl, the voice of a long-dead singer crooning about love and loss. It felt like a secret shared just between me and the house. I danced alone in the living room, my bare feet slipping across the newly polished floors. I let the music wash over me, the melody bright and defiant, and for the first time in a long while, I laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a quiet bubble of joy, like a sunrise inside my chest. In the middle of all this, I got a call from my brother. His voice was hesitant, careful in a way that made me think he'd been practicing the words before he dialed. "I just wanted to see how you're doing," he said. "I'm good," I said, surprised to realize how true it felt. The house is coming along. It feels like home. I'm glad he said, and there was a pause heavy with all the things we hadn't said. I'm sorry, he added quietly, and I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. I know, I said. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just moving forward. Good, he said. You deserve that. We didn't talk long, but when I hung up, I felt lighter, like another door had closed softly behind me, leaving me free to walk ahead. That night, I stood on the porch and looked out at the street, the snow glimmering in the moonlight. I thought about how far I'd come, about the nights I'd spent, wondering if I'd ever feel whole again, if I'd ever find a place that felt like mine. And I thought about the house, about the way it had stood silent and waiting, holding the echoes of every voice that had ever passed through its halls. Now it was holding me too. As I turned to go back inside, I whispered a promise to the night air, the words slipping out soft and sure. I'm here to stay. Because I wasn't just fixing a house, I was building a life. One filled with light and laughter, and the quiet, fierce certainty that I had earned every inch of this place. And as I closed the door behind me, the warmth of the house wrapped around me, and I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Spring came slowly, like a promise whispered on the wind. The daffodils I'd planted pushed their way through the thawing earth, bright and defiant. They bloomed in small, stubborn clumps around the porch, each one a reminder that even the coldest winter couldn't last forever. The house had come alive with the season. I painted the front door a cheerful red, a color that made the whole place seem to smile. In the mornings, I'd drink my coffee on the porch steps, the sun warm on my face, and watch the world wake up around me. Neighbors would pass by and wave their eyes, crinkling in soft smiles. The girl who'd been invisible had become someone worth noticing. Inside, the rooms felt brighter. I'd filled them with little pieces of myself, books stacked high on shelves, plants in sunny windows, mismatched dishes that reminded me of every yard sale I'd ever wandered through. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that made it enough. One afternoon, I found myself in the living room, a box of old photographs spread across the coffee table. I picked up each one, slowly, studying the faces and places frozen in time. My mother's laughter, my father's easy grin, my brother's boyish smile, pieces of a life I'd lost but never forgotten. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the ache of those memories like I once had. Instead, I felt gratitude. Those moments had made me who I was, taught me how to bend but not break. I'd carried their weight for so long, but now they felt light, like stepping stones instead of chains. I put the photographs back in the box and set it on a shelf in the corner. The past would always be part of this house, part of me, but it didn't own me anymore. That night, I invited a few neighbors over for dinner. Mrs. Foster brought a pie, warm and sweet, and Mr. Jenkins from 2 doors down offered to help me fix the squeaky hinge on the screen door. We sat around the kitchen table, the radio playing softly in the background, and shared stories and laughter that felt as warm as the light spilling from the windows. I realized then that the house wasn't just walls and floors, it was people. It was the laughter that echoed off the ceiling, the stories shared over chipped mugs, the quiet comfort of knowing that you weren't alone anymore. As the night wound down, I stood on the porch and watched my guests walk home under the soft glow of the street lamps. The air was cool, fragrant, with the scent of new grass and blooming flowers. I closed my eyes and breathed it in, feeling the weight of the past lift a little more with every exhale. I whispered to the night, "Thank you." And in the hush that followed, I heard the house sigh in contentment, the old wood settling like it was finally at peace. Summer arrived with the hum of cicadas and long golden evenings. The house was alive in a way I'd never known it could be. I painted the last room, a small, cozy study, with a window that caught the morning sun, and stood back to admire it, the soft yellow walls glowing like a sunrise. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch, swing a book in my lap, and a glass of sweet tea sweating in my hand. The city buzzed around me, the laughter of children playing down the street, the distant bark of a dog. It all felt like music, a symphony of small, ordinary joys. My brother came by, sometimes his visits quiet and tentative at first, but growing easier as the months passed. We didn't talk about the past anymore. We didn't need to. We sat on the steps and shared stories of work and life, small things that felt like the stitching of something new and whole. One night, as I was sweeping the front porch, he looked up at the house and said softly, "You really brought it back to life." I smiled, my hands gripping the worn handle of the broom. It brought me back to life, too. He nodded, and I saw the truth of it settle in his eyes. We didn't say anything else, but we didn't need to. Some things didn't need words. The house had become more than I ever dreamed. It was laughter echoing through the kitchen. It was fresh paint and wildflowers in the yard. It was the warmth of the sun through the windows, the quiet strength of the walls that had stood through every storm. It was mine. As the summer nights grew long and the air turned sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine, I realized something else too. I wasn't just living in this house. I was building a life. One full of light and hope, and the fierce, quiet certainty that no matter what, I was enough. And I knew as I stood on the porch that night, the house behind me, solid and warm, that I was no longer just the girl who'd been cast aside. I was the woman who'd come home, who'd claimed every inch of this place and every inch of herself. I looked out at the street, at the world I'd carved a place for myself in, and I felt a peace I'd never known before. I took a deep breath and let it fill me, let it settle in the spaces that had once been empty. And as I turned back inside the door, closing softly behind me, I whispered to the quiet house, "This is only the beginning." Because the truth is, every ending is just the start of something new. And this house, this home, was only the first chapter of a story I was still writing. If this story moved, you share it with someone you know. Let me know in the comments. What did this story make you feel? Have you ever felt the power of claiming your own space, your own life? I'd love to hear your stories too.